Welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us a truly fascinating stack of sources today, all circling around, well, one of the biggest questions, really. Where did we, Homo sapiens, actually come from?
It's fundamental, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, the simple story we often hear, the one that's been popular for decades.
The standard textbook version.
Exactly. Is that we emerged as like a single group in one spot in East Africa, maybe 100, 200,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And then spread out, replacing everyone else,
Yeah.
with very little mixing. A clean story.
Very neat and tidy.
But this material you provided, it paints a very different picture. It suggests that simple story might be, in its most basic form,
Yeah.
well, maybe more of a fairy tale, as one source put it.
That's a perfect way to phrase it, yeah. Our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack the evidence you've gathered here.
Okay.
We want to pull out the key insights, the surprising facts, and these new perspectives that really challenge that straightforward out-of-Africa replacement idea. And specifically, we'll look at this thing called the out-of-Eurasia hypothesis as maybe a better framework.
Out of Eurasia.
Yeah, because what's clear from these sources is that all the new genetic discoveries, the fossil finds, they're painting a much, well, messier picture.
Messier.
Definitely more interconnected than we used to think. Not a straight line at all.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Just hearing the old story called a fairy tale is pretty striking. I'm ready to get into the specifics.
Good.
Let's see how these new findings really change the story we thought we knew about ourselves.
Let's do it.
So just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's quickly recap that traditional view. The traditional out-of-Africa hypothesis, wait.
Right.
It says single origin point, East Africa, usually somewhere like 100 to 200,000 years back, YBP, years before present.
Mm-hmm.
Then Homo sapiens basically move out globally, replace other hominins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, mostly without much gene exchange. Minimal stuff.
And that got a big boost from early mitochondrial DNA studies, right?
Yeah.
Back in the late 80s.
Yeah, exactly. They seem to trace all modern human maternal lines back to one African ancestor, mitochondrial Eve.
Suggested a recent bottleneck, everyone coming from that one source fairly recently.
Right. So that's the old picture.
Okay. And the evidence you've brought in introduces this out-of-Eurasia hypothesis, OOAH.
OOAH.
Yeah, as a framework that tries to, capture more of the data that's piling up. It doesn't kick Africa out of the picture, not at all.
Okay.
But it shifts the focus. It's less about a single origin and a one-way street.
And more.
More dynamic, multi-directional interaction across huge areas over long times.
Okay, so if the old story is OOH, what's the biggest clash? Where does the OOAH really differ based on these sources?
I think what really jumps out is how we think about Eurasia's role. That's the big shift.
How so?
Well, the traditional story saw Eurasia mainly as just, a place humans arrived from Africa and then replaced whoever was there, a receiver.
Right.
The OOAH, though, sees Eurasia more as a center of diversification, maybe even a donor region.
A donor.
Yeah.
Meaning,
Contributing lineages, genetic traits back into Africa.
whoa, okay, so not just out of Africa, but potentially into Africa as well.
Exactly. Significant movements into Africa seem to be part of the story, too, according to this view. And that just completely flips the traditional picture, doesn't
It
it?
really does. It changes the whole flow.
Absolutely. And that leads to the other key differences you see in the sources comparing them. Origin point. Not necessarily one tiny spot, maybe broader, maybe inputs from outside Africa.
Okay.
Primary dispersal, not just out, but multidirectional, including those into Africa waves.
Right.
And the interbreeding, not minor, significant, extensive even.
So the evidence base shifts too.
Yeah, it's not just about the oldest African fossils and that early mtDNA anymore. Now it's things like finding early Homo sapiens genetic traces in Eurasian hominins, the rich Eurasian fossil record itself, and those clear genetic fingerprints showing movement back into Africa.
That's a huge rewrite, not just a minor adjustment.
It really is. And a lot of this momentum, this change, comes from the genetic evidence.
Right. The DNA.
Yeah. Studies over the last, decade or two, they've just undeniably shown significant admixture.
Admixture meaning mixing, interbreeding.
Exactly. Genetic material swapping between modern humans and archaic groups like Neanderthals and Denisovans.
And this wasn't just a one-off thing. It was common.
Very common, especially outside Africa. Your sources point out, for example, that something like 1 to 2% of the DNA in people of Eurasian descent today comes directly from Neanderthals.
1 to 2%. That sounds like a lot, actually.
It is, and in some East Asian groups it might be higher. Plus you have Denisovan DNA mixed in too, especially in places like Melanesia.
So that idea of simple replacement, where we just showed up and they vanished, that's out.
Pretty much. This widespread genetic mixing flatly contradicts it. Our own genomes carry echoes of these other ancient humans.
Wow. Okay, so if we were mixing that much, does that mean they weren't really totally separate species in the way we usually think about it? Like, horses and donkeys can interbreed, but the offspring are usually sterile? This was different.
That's a fantastic point. And yes, the fact that Homo sapiens could apparently produce fertile offspring with Neanderthals and Denisovans, it seriously challenges that strict biological species concept for them. It points much more towards maybe assimilation, interconnected populations, rather than totally distinct, isolated groups.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, here's where it gets really wild, and this is a critical bit from your sources.
Okay.
Genetic analysis, looking deep into ancient DNA, has found evidence of Homo sapiens-type mitochondrial DNA, you know, the maternal line DNA,
Yeah.
showing up in Neanderthals. And get this. It happened in Eurasia maybe around 500,000 years ago.
Wait, 500,000 years ago. Hold on. The main out-of-Africa event is usually pegged at, what, 60 or 70,000 years ago?
Exactly. That's why this is so significant.
So finding our kind of mtDNA in Eurasian Neanderthals that long ago, what does that imply?
Well, for Homo sapiens, or let's say a very closely related ancestral group's mitochondrial DNA to be present and mixing with Neanderthal lineages outside of Africa 500,000 years ago, it strongly suggests some form of us, or our direct ancestors, were already in Eurasia and interacting with Neanderthals way, way earlier than that main 60K YBP dispersal.
Oh, it messes with the timeline completely.
It really does. It suggests much earlier movements, maybe waves of movement and complex interactions long before we thought. It definitely fits better with an OOAH type model than the simple OOAH.
Wow, okay. And you mentioned movements back into Africa.
Yes. Another key genetic insight from your sources. When scientists compare the family trees you get from mtDNA, the maternal line, and Y chromosome DNA, the paternal line, they find what they call full phylogenetic coherence. Basically, both lines tell a consistent story. And that story is highly consistent with, potentially, listen to this, 4 translocations of modern humans from Eurasia into Africa.
4 waves. Back into Africa.
Potentially, yes. And the earliest of these estimated movements into Africa might be around 250,000 years ago.
250,000 years ago. Moving from Eurasia to Africa.
That's what the analysis suggests. It's direct genetic support for that into Africa part of the OOAH. And it really hammers away at the old idea of just a one-way street out of Africa.
So the genes are painting this picture of ancient mixing, really early presence outside Africa, and even movement back in. Does the fossil evidence line up with this? Especially the Eurasian fossils?
It lines up very nicely, actually. The paleontology supports this complex OOAH framework, too.
How so?
Well, think about those incredibly early Homo erectus fossils found at Dmanisi in Georgia.
Oh, yeah, those are super old, right?
Extremely old. Around 1.8, almost 1.9 million years ago, MYA.
Wow.
Your sources highlight how this fits perfectly with the view that the genus Homo didn't just stay in Africa initially. Homo erectus moved out very early.
Right.
And then, crucially, underwent significant evolution and diversification outside of Africa.
So evolution happening in Eurasia, not just Africa.
Exactly. If erectus is out there that early, and then you see later groups evolving in Eurasia, like Homo heidelbergensis, which seems ancestral to both Neanderthals and Denisovans, it strongly implies that a major part of the evolutionary story that eventually leads to us happened within Eurasia. They weren't just waiting to be replaced. They were part of the broader human story, contributing lineages, maybe traits.
That pushes back hard against the idea that all the important steps towards Homo sapiens only happened in Africa.
It does. And this period, the Middle Pleistocene, roughly, say, 770,000 down to about 130,000 years ago, it's always been a bit confusing. Fossil-wise, it's often called the muddle in the middle.
The muddle in the middle, okay.
Yeah, sorting out who's related to who can be tricky. And your sources mention that scientists are proposing new ways to categorize fossils from this time, like using the species name Homo bodoensis.
Homo bodoensis, that's a new one on me. Why introduce that name? What does it help clarify about this muddle?
Well, according to the material you gave us, Homo bodoensis is suggested as a label for most of those Middle Pleistocene human fossils you find in Africa, and also some in Southeast Europe.
Okay.
The idea is it helps clarify that this group, Bodoensis, was likely a direct ancestor of us, of Homo sapiens.
Ah, okay. So on our line.
Right. But, and this is important, it also makes it clearer that Homo bodoensis was not the last common ancestor of both us and the main Eurasian groups like Neanderthals and Denisovans.
Meaning the split between our line and their line happened before Bodoensis.
Exactly. The split was earlier, so Bodoensis represents our lineage after that split, but before fully modern Homo sapiens. It helps acknowledge the major branches and the significant geographical variation happening during that long period.
Got it. That makes sense. But what about the African fossils? They must still be key.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. And your sources talk about really important African finds, like the Jebel Irhoud fossils found in Morocco.
Not East Africa.
Right. And they're now dated to around 300,000 years ago.
300,000? That's older than a lot of the classic East African finds, isn't it?
It is. Older than Homo kibish, for example. And then you also have other important fossils like the Floresbad skull from South Africa.
So finds across Africa, not just one region.
Precisely. And this feeds into what your sources call the Pan-African model of our origins.
Pan-African, meaning across all of Africa.
Kind of, yeah. The idea is we didn't just pop into existence in one small valley. Instead, the traits that define Homo sapiens emerged across a huge interconnected area of the African continent.
Through mixing and interaction between different groups.
Exactly, through gene flow and interaction between various ancient human populations spread across Africa.
Okay, and what do those specific fossils, like Jebel Irhoud, tell us?
What's really telling about fossils like Jebel Irhoud is their mosaic nature.
Mosaic, like bits and pieces.
Yeah. They have some features that look quite modern, particularly in the face, but other features, like the overall shape of the brain case, are more archaic, more elongated, not like the round skull we have.
So not the complete modern human package all at once.
Exactly. And that's powerful evidence that modernity didn't just switch on like a light bulb. It wasn't a single package deal that evolved in one place at one time.
Different features evolved at different rates.
Yes, and potentially in different places across Africa. And possibly influenced by interactions with groups in Eurasia, given the other evidence we've discussed.
This is getting really complex.
It is. So when you stand back and try to synthesize it all, you've got this deep genetic diversity within Africa itself. You've got the undeniable genetic proof of extensive mixing with Neanderthals and Denisovans in Eurasia.
Right, the 1-2% and more.
You've got clear genetic signals of movement back into Africa from Eurasia.
That 250,000-year-old wave, potentially.
And you have the fossil records showing really early dispersal out of Africa by Erectus, then diversification within Eurasia, and these mosaic modern archaic fossils across Africa. It paints a picture of, well, continuous gene flow, adaptation, interaction across huge distances over incredibly deep time. It just doesn't look like an isolated origin followed by a simple, clean expansion.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together then. Based on everything in this material you gave us, the genetics showing deep mixing and these multi-directional movements, including into Africa,
Right.
Combined with the fossils showing early Eurasian diversification and those mosaic traits popping up across different regions.
It really forces us to see our evolution as incredibly dynamic, super complex.
But not a straight line.
Definitely not. It looks like multiple dispersals, maybe going in different directions at different times, lots of recurring gene flow, these intricate interactions between diverse groups of hominins across both Africa and Eurasia.
So that simple, linear, out-of-Africa replacement model. The fairy tale.
It's just not holding up. Your sources are remarkably consistent on this. The sheer weight of the genetic and fossil evidence we have now just doesn't support it anymore.
And you can almost feel that shift in the language scientists use in these papers you provided.
You really can. They use phrases like complex scenario. They talk about the muddle in the middle, fuzzy boundaries between groups, messy origins.
A language itself tells a story, doesn't it?
It does. It signals this growing consensus that human evolution wasn't like that neat branching tree we see in simple diagrams.
More like a dome.
More like a tangled web.
Yeah.
Or maybe a braided stream. A highly reticulated, geographically diverse process. Lots of different populations moving, bumping into each other, mixing over vast stretches of time.
And those into Africa movements you mentioned, they seem crucial to this OOAH idea, right?
They are.
And they kind of click when you think about that super early sapiens-like mtDNA in Eurasian Neanderthals and the mosaic way modern traits appeared. It suggests connection, not isolation.
Precisely. It all points towards connection and complexity. So this isn't about just swapping one simple story for another.
Right.
It's about moving away from that overly simplistic, tree-like view of our past and towards acknowledging, really embracing, a much more complex, web-like, interconnected model of how we came to be. And that's what your sources are so effectively arguing for.
Wow. This deep dive into the material you brought it's really opened up a much richer, way more interconnected human story than that simple version we're often told.
Yeah, it's a fantastic example of science working, isn't it? We gather more evidence and the picture changes, it gets refined.
But it sounds like there are still big challenges.
Oh, absolutely. Big challenges remain. Like, how do you even define a species clearly when you see all this ancient interbreeding?
No question.
And mapping out all those ancient movements precisely across deep time, that's still incredibly difficult work. But the evidence keeps coming in, and our models have to adapt.
So frameworks like the OOAH are part of that adaptation.
Exactly. There are crucial steps in that ongoing process. We're revising our understanding based on what we find. It's exciting, really.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on.
Yeah.
Something that comes right out of this material.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean for how we think about ourselves, about human identity, about our history, if our origins aren't this simple tree branching from one root in one place, but instead this dynamic, maybe kind of messy, interconnected web? A web woven across continents, threaded through millions of years of deep time.
That's a profound question to end on. It really reframes things.
It does.
Well, thank you for bringing us these sources. It's prompted a really fascinating deep dive into our shared and clearly very complex past.
Absolutely.
Ha!
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.